What did you think of the film?
I really enjoyed it. Like, I thought, obviously there's been a lot of biopics out recently, but I thought this one was done quite well. At times it did feel a bit rushed, but I thought the initial, like, first, like, hour or so was done really well.
I had the complete opposite of you, Natasha. I didn't so much get into the first hour of it, and by the end of it, I think I just kind of, in a film sense, let myself go and just really enjoyed, by the end of it, like the roller coaster. And I stopped trying to kind of soak in every second of it and just enjoyed it for kind of the biopic that really stretched decades. It was one of those biopics. What did you think?
I agree with Natasha, really. I really liked that first hour when it focused on like 50s Elvis. I really liked the politics behind it, which I'm sure we'll get onto later on. I really enjoyed that focus, and by the time I was gripped into that, they sort of moved on to like him being older and like, his story like, after that, which was also like enjoyable, but I was more interested in the earlier times. But it was a good film throughout, very, very well acted and very, just well told.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I would go as far as to say as it was one of my favourite cinematic experiences, because I saw it in cinema when it came out, and I remember walking out just feeling like the world had changed. I then rewatched it at the weekend to see if I felt the same, and I did still get goosebumps pretty much throughout, but I think I can give a reason as to why like the first half maybe felt a bit more enjoyable, was that it was an exhausting watch.
Yeah.
It's so fast paced, and you really think, oh, it's going to slow down for a bit, and it does slow down, but it's obviously all about his music, and his music is played throughout, and it's all about how tumultuous his life was, and I think it just gets too much towards the end. You're then thinking, okay, I obviously feel really sad for him, I wish that things would work out. You obviously know, because it happened in the past, that it's not a Tarantino film.
Yeah.
But it just felt like a natural ending to the film, because you were slightly slowing down a bit. But I really thought the first half, at least, it made me want to go out and listen to some Elvis music. It made me really want to learn more about it, and I did. I think the evening I watched it at cinema, I spent about 3 hours on Wikipedia, but after that I think its magic sort of wore off. It was something that when I then watched at the weekend, I appreciated the elements of it. I could see so much of Baz Luhrmann all over the place. You know, it was a real Baz Luhrmann film, but yeah, good but exhausting, I'd say.
No, I think it's interesting because I felt like the songs at the end of Elvis's life were the most interesting lyrically, like especially the last song to end the film, and I thought the ending was probably the strongest scene of the whole film, when it went very seamlessly from Austin Butler to the real Elvis, and Austin Butler's dedication, you know, to the entire film, with how he looked like, his accent, his gyrating. He definitely deserved the BAFTA, which he won last night for Best Actor. And I liked the first songs, and they're very catchy, but I think for me, as someone who doesn't know much about Elvis at all, I felt like his later years, his songs had more depth, and I think the film did a good job in showing his influence on black culture and the civil rights movement. And at first I thought they mentioned, you know, the Martin Luther King and then Bobby Kennedy's death quite a lot, but I think for someone like Elvis, who is an artist and not a politician, just those major events in America's history will have changed him too, and you know, his transformation as an artist. So I kind of quite liked the political element of it, and I agree with you completely. If you don't really like Baz Luhrmann, I wouldn't really recommend this film for you. And I kept thinking of The Great Gatsby whenever I watched it, and what did you guys think about the modern music in it? For example, I think they used Toxic by Britney Spears.
There was a bit of Doja Cat in there. And
what did you think?
Well, in cinema, when I started to hear it, I really did feel like I was taken aback. I felt, okay, what they're doing here, and I kind of I got on board with it, but it was a scene on Beale Street with Elvis there. You know, it's an Elvis film. I was expecting a bit of Elvis. You know, probably mostly Elvis. You know, if you watch Mamma Mia, there's no, you know,
Yeah.
It's called Staying Alive playing. So when that started happening, I thought, okay, this is a bit bizarre, but it sort of worked. It worked, and I was no longer surprised. I had pretty much the same reaction when I watched it at the weekend. And I was like, oh yeah, I remember this part. This is the part where Doja Cat starts playing.
Yeah, the first couple of times it happened, it did take me out, because I know films set in this generation of like in certain areas sort of stick to songs from that era. So when I did sort of hear a bit of like modern music, it's like, oh, this is weird how they've done this. It did take me out, but then as we did it consistently, not like a lot, but as we did it throughout, I sort of got used to it. It kind of did weave like sort of old music and the new music quite well throughout. But yeah, overall, I thought it was, like, although like it did take some time to get used to, like it was quite nice overall. I thought.
Yeah, like it did feel like a bit random initially, but I think because obviously I was working at cinema as well, like I'd heard this Vegas by Doja Cat so many times, I was like, it's gonna come in somewhere. But like in a way, like it could almost be a bit like, because he used obviously like the gospel music and the music he heard as like inspiration, like it could just show how like it's still timeless now, like there's still modern artists now like remixing parts of like Elvis's music.
Yeah, I think it's that choice, so the past is not the past and it's all old-fashioned music, and they've done that in so many films where it's kind of like a soundtrack, but it is important that it doesn't become like a jukebox kind of musical with the people and not Elvis. So I think they just about managed the balance of it, and the reason why as well, I think you're completely right, it's just about the influencing and music. I kind of thought by the end of it they were saying no one really owns music, it's just all like a random mess. And I think that was interesting when you consider how a lot of modern criticism of Elvis has been about race and about stealing from black artists. That's been alleged quite a few times, and with this I don't think they shied away with it. I think they made it central to the whole film, but I think without even using the script, through using other people's music like Britney Spears, they're just saying music is music, it's ideas, it's like facts, ideas, information. You can't really copyright a sound or a feeling, but obviously there is plagiarism within music, which is wrong. But I think they were just saying without script that it to defend Elvis.
I think it would have felt like a weird film if it didn't touch on those ideas and it didn't touch on that culture. I, before watching the film, didn't really know his full biography, and I felt like I got a great idea of what it was like, dramatization aside. But I think the discussion of like where he drew his influences from, they gave a good nod to it throughout, and I think that they could have maybe gone a bit deeper here and there, because there's a comment from B.B. King, I think. He said that boy would make like 10 times less than you if he released that song, and Elvis sort of shrugs it off, and that may well have been his reaction. But you know, if they were going to dramatize something, they could have, you know, maybe interpreted what his reaction might have been, may or may not have been true. I'm not too sure of that, but
I feel like there was a theme throughout the film where we sort of touch upon important topics. They go into it and maybe sort of very quickly take you out of it. Whereas I think they could have spent more time delving into these topics of like race and stuff. So go on.
I feel like the way they took you out of it was by getting Tom Parker in. He would just, I know Elvis would want to try and touch upon a political issue or something, and then Tom Parker would come in and drag him out, and it almost felt a little bit like he was apologizing for Elvis, or sorry, no, not apologizing for Elvis, but he then became the scapegoat. Yeah. And we thought, okay, maybe Elvis really did want to do all of this stuff, but it was Tom Parker's fault. We should blame Tom Parker, and I don't know whether that's necessarily true or not. But
I think firstly, capitalism and the way money works is Tom Parker represents, he apologises for the racist South in America, because at the end of the day, they're just consumers. You know, so he does not care about the politics of anyone. So he kind of is that figurehead of that very capitalistic way. And then art, music is an interesting, it's kind of like journalism in that it's got both the commercial and, you know, the creative side. And Elvis may want to do all his creative stuff, but if he didn't ever do the commercial stuff, like wear the Christmas sweater, then how is he supposed to make money for the TV network? And they did. I thought the TV scenes were one of the most interesting because it's a new medium. Elvis has to like adapt and evolve to it, and he, in fairness, he really did, and it kind of revitalized his whole career again, as what because Hollywood was fading at that time with the B movies, and it's interesting that Hollywood's golden years, Elvis contributes to the downfall of Hollywood a bit from its shine by doing all those cheap movies and just propaganda, really. So I think Tom Parker really represents that. I thought Tom Parker was dreadfully acted, and a character. I thought Tom Hanks' acting, at certain bits it was quite good, but I felt throughout the whole film that I was watching a fat suit, and it really did not look realistic. And the whole film was already so cartoonish.
It felt so
put
gimmicky.
that cartoonish character in it.
I don't think they really knew what direction they wanted the character, like comedic or serious, or they didn't really pick a direct line. They didn't really pick like a certain character. It was just kind of like 4 different personalities in one, and they, in the end, by the end, he was meant to be painted as like this villain, but throughout, like for half of it, he was like a comedy character, like someone who's a bit jokey and a bit funny. But I don't know, I found it a bit, maybe the acting kind of is a bit harsh, but I was thinking the character wasn't really well drawn out and very well portrayed.
I thought he was acted well from a perspective of I really hated him.
Yeah.
I really did think that he was manipulative. I really did think that he was the person who stood in front of so much success and basically put his hand up and said no. I think it felt weird though, and it felt weird in a Baz Luhrmann kind of way, which is why I gave it a bit more credit than maybe perhaps it was due. But yeah, not really sure who else could have done that role, to be honest.
I think
but
anyone really could have. So there's a few actors. There was this guy off Feud who's like a larger actor, and he always plays like a creepy guy. So there's kind of a few in my head who, when I was watching it, I was like, yeah, he could probably do a better job. And again, there's lots of British and American actors who could have put on a southern accent, not a southern accent, sorry, a Dutch accent, which was in a southerner's kind of outfit, which was an interesting combination. And again, I think that in my head, even though this is based off real life fact, it does link again to he was a kind of a caricature of racism, not just in the US, but also Dutch racism in Africa and other places as well. I just thought this film would be near a classic if Tom Hanks was replaced, because I felt like at certain bits I was like, this film could win awards, but actually maybe the Academy might turn it down with Tom Hanks.
So would you sort of say like Tom Hanks' portrayal of like this character, was that like your main criticism of his film?
Yes, I felt like the first scene, to me, when it's all about the snowman, to me I was going for a film about Elvis. Every time they dwell too long on the Colonel, I just personally found it very boring and wanted to switch off. And I didn't have any emotional connection to the character too. So why would I root for... And Elvis, I have to say, I had a very shallow connection, and I think this was on purpose because, like The Great Gatsby, Gatsby is Elvis, you know, Nick is the Colonel, so they kind of copied The Great Gatsby again, you know, his previous film. So the protagonist is like the secondary character, and because of that, I never got that close to Elvis, even though he had such poverty in his life. The wallpaper stories I've already heard about, and that's why he did struggle with food addiction and alcoholism and like pill popping, because of his like horrible childhood, being dirt poor. And they did show that in the beginning, but I think Elvis was always just, because of how the film was structured, he was just always kept at arm's length.
I think if they'd have developed the characters like more, like really focus on what they wanted to portray, then maybe like it would have come across, especially like with the Colonel, because like he just kind of I think he acted it quite well, because like I did end up really disliking him as the film went on. But like I think if maybe they took longer to initiate him as a character, but more of a wider range, rather than just being like, oh, he's spotted Elvis, like, and then just follow straight from there, maybe then it might feel a bit different.
I don't know, I felt they could have raised the stakes with his character a bit more. Like they put pressure on him from the government side of it. They wanted to deport him, or they wanted to like put him in jail or something. I felt like they could have pushed that a bit harder, maybe made it clear to the audience that look, he has pressures. He needs to make Elvis. He needs to like push the Elvis as the performer a bit more because he needs the money. He needs to like really make sure he's got that like straight and narrow, like so he doesn't get deported or whatever like happens to it.
So that only like came like 3/4 into the film. You were like, oh, like I think if that had been initiated more at the start, you would have like the audience would have like maybe grown to dislike him even more. And be like, he's only doing it for this reason. But
yeah, I didn't like the start with the Colonel's death/dying and then Elvis is dying. That double kind of start to me was almost the weakest part of the film, because when it was that, do you know Romeo and Juliet by Baz Luhrmann, and they do the prologue and it's everyone speaking it, so they did that again this time, and I just don't think it really fit the whole film. And I think it was those tonal issues where I didn't really mind having a cartoon showing that Elvis wanted to be Superman, because I've heard that before and I felt it was a nice way to illustrate it. But I just felt like it was just too many of his other films I could just see in it, and then I felt like...
Do you feel like it could have just jumped straight into Colonel Parker finding Elvis, or like where do you feel it should have started then? Like,
I think it just should have... I don't think this should be a serious issue film just about addiction, but I think it should have just focused to begin with on just how poor Elvis was.
I
just
really
his
agree,
poverty.
because they started off by doing a bit of a cartoon, as you say, on how poor he was and how mistakes made by the family ended them in a black neighborhood, and then you just thrown right into the black neighborhood, and you sort of expected to just guess that means that they're going to be dirt poor, but you don't really get a good idea of what their lives were like.
That's just addressed in the cartoon, and then he just appears like
and then perhaps for me one of the most invigorating scenes of cinema I've ever seen was when he went into that tent and they were listening to the gospel music. And I thought, wow, that's like listening to your favourite song just as you're about to get into the fastest part of your run, because I just felt like on fire, but I'd already forgotten why we were there, how we'd got there, why that was potentially an important turning point perhaps, or I got the idea that was where his inspirations came from, but so far as that was concerned, we had just seen him sort of hanging out on the street in a sort of poor looking town. To me it just looked like an old town.
Oldie worldy.
It just looked like an old town. I didn't know whether that was a poor town.
I know what you mean. I agree. I really think that if you'd just shown a bit of the trauma of the poverty, then it would be just something that you could link the film back to. And the film actually never really... It did a bit... Actually, one of the strongest scenes, I think, was the climax, in a way, of the film was when he was in Vegas, and they showed his first song that he ever did, that he was performing in his first song in Vegas. And that took you back to the past. That worked very effectively because you could see how far the characters come over 20 years, and it was like a homecoming. But I think that homecoming could have been even stronger if we'd just seen how much of a fighter Elvis really was. And he wasn't a brain, and I think this is why I liked that they almost critiqued him having a superficial engagement with the civil rights movement, because Elvis is so talented, but he's not because of his background, because of his poverty. For him, it's about art, making money. He's not a thinker. That's how I would describe Elvis.
I think they tried to portray that as him pre him going to war, or just in that first sort of hour of the film when he does try to fight against the authority, I guess, or fight against the establishment. And they did try and push that as like him being like a different thing, like just trying to be above or trying to fight against it. And I felt, I didn't really see that side of it. I didn't really know that he had that side of it to him. And then that kind of goes away as the film goes on. Like he's kind of, his mind isn't really pushed.
Here's a question then.
Because obviously, I feel like I came into this film not knowing a great deal about Elvis's life. So obviously I can't compare it to any historical notes or whatever. But I don't know. Maybe the dad relationship. I feel like if that had maybe been developed more, because it just felt like he was all right with signing away, to be part of the business side of it. But then, realistically, you don't, because it didn't focus on as we were saying, the prior start of his poverty life. Would he have been so easy to sign, or because the mum kind of had more jeopardy that she didn't want to share her Elvis with she always wanted to protect him. So that felt more realistic. But then the dad one, maybe, I feel like if it had developed more, maybe that would have felt a bit put on. I don't know.
I agree with Natasha. I feel like if I'd known the story a bit better, maybe I could have wheedled out what parts were sort of made on license, where they sort of had a bit of a clue of what happened and then added a bit that wasn't real. I think the part when Colonel Tom Parker starts listing down all the things from 1956 that they owed him, I mean, it's possible, but for me, I was like, surely he hasn't got one big long list, and if so, then that's not a dick move, not a
Poor move. Yeah.
not a poor move, but I think it made you hate his character more. It made you hate him and what he stood for, but then it also made you think about the dad. It made you think about Elvis, and you think, surely one of you is responsible enough to know how to manage finances and to realise that your friends are taking advantage of your...
Did any of you know the age gap between Priscilla and Elvis?
It was,
I've got a feeling she was quite young when they
How
met.
young do you think she was?
I know, but I'm not...
Well, did you get it from the film though?
No.
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 How old?
I just kind of like assumed she was like teenager-ish,
Yeah.
but it didn't really allude.
Very young, 14 and
Okay.
24, so it's a 10-year age gap. And also, my roommate came into this film and he was loving it. He was telling me like IMDb facts about it, and he's not watched it before, but he was saying it was common at the time for many kind of the hill. Do you know they kept using the word hillbilly in the film? I think Elvis's cousins and entourage also married young. It wasn't just Elvis who did that. And in America, you'd go across state lines to states where it was legal to marry so young. So that's how they got away with it, Priscilla and Elvis. And they had quite a long marriage in their defense, but in celebrity Hollywood terms, and they had a child as well, which the film showed. But for such an age gap, for that not to really be addressed in the film, it did seem to whitewash it a bit.
I don't know, like are they? I felt like throughout the film there was sort of they didn't want to offend Elvis's family, I guess. Who I guess would have been watching it because they would have got access to information about Elvis through his family, and I guess the filmmakers wouldn't have wanted to portray Elvis in not in a too bad way, I guess, because there are obviously there must have been dark sides to Elvis that they wouldn't have shown on in the film, so maybe they just would have hidden that fact just to protect the family, I guess.
I think you're completely right. I think the Priscilla and Elvis relationship, they kept it so cordial
because the daughter
for someone that divorced.
Because their daughter was still alive, obviously, when and she recently passed away. Lisa Marie.
Lisa Marie, yeah.
Yeah, so she recently passed away, but I think they would have done it to protect like someone like her as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's just an ethical dilemma of doing a biopic, because I think the Elton John, one, I thought, even though it wasn't What's and all, I felt like it was quite with Taron. I thought it was quite honest, and it kind of it didn't always show Elton in the most flattering light. It kind of showed him as a...
I'll be honest, I haven't seen the Queen one, the Freddie Mercury one, or the Elton one, but like, how would you compare this one to these two, I guess? Like, right? If you were to rank him, how would you go about ranking?
Do you have a ranking, Brendan?
I've not seen Rocket Man. It's on my list, but I also saw Bohemian Rhapsody at the cinema, and that for me, maybe behind Blade Runner 2049, was the best film I ever saw in the cinema.
Yeah.
I think Elvis, top 5 for cinema experiences. That's not necessarily saying a lot, but I think you have to watch it in cinema.
Yeah.
I think it's one of those films where you'll get so much more out of it, knowing that you're getting pounded by the noise all over. But I think the Freddie Mercury one was a lot more detailed in its depiction of him as a young man, as Farrah Bosara, when he was growing up, experiencing the racism, experiencing the 70s as this sort of weird time for him to be exploring his sexuality. I don't know whether they did that.
I think
well.
all 3 films have amazing best actors in them. Bohemian Rhapsody. I think Bohemian Rhapsody and Rocket Man are so similar as films about characters who are musicians struggling with their sexuality. That time period of Britain in the 70s, 80s. They're actually very similar films, and they came out within a year. They're endlessly compared with each other. All three have amazing actors. I think I agree with you, Bohemian Rhapsody was better, just in general. I think Rocket Man is also better than this film in general. I think this film isn't the death of this genre of biopic. I think there'll be plenty more, but I think it was a lot hotter a few years ago, that genre, when they were all coming out and it felt new and exciting. And I agree with you, you should, if this film does come back in any cinema, it probably will with its BAFTA win, do try and see it in a cinema. I think my laptop to my TV, connecting it wasn't the best. It could have been a bit better. I did buffer it for a while and made sure it was fine, but in a cinema I think it would have, it's just too much on the screen for it to be in a small screen, too many colours. And I agree with you, the gospel scene, it was amazing at home, but it would have been better in a cinema.
Like, I watched Bohemian Rhapsody in a cinema, and I think like nothing like could beat the goosebumps I got from like the Live Aid performance and everything. But obviously, like they're about two separate people, and like obviously that was more in America. This is like, but for me, I feel like that one was maybe done better just because we got like a more of a raw depiction of like how Queen started and then like Freddie's dilemmas and everything. Whereas this one, I don't know, like parts of it just felt a bit too rushed for me. But
yeah, the death, they'd never dwelled into Elvis's dying days and his pill popping too much. They did show it coming, whereas in Bohemian Rhapsody they didn't overdo it on the dying, but Freddie Mercury's death is kind of central to how we remember him, to be honest. But it is with Elvis, and I think they consciously did that for the family, to protect the family. So it's not an unflattering depiction of someone in their last years. Why should we focus on someone's worst period of time when we're remembering them? But from a film point of view, if you just do too much whitewashing, then at the end you'll forget how much Elvis struggled and where he came from.
What moment in the film did you feel the most sympathy for Elvis? I have an idea, but I don't know whether it's shared.
I think it's the point where in the late 50s when he had to go to war, or they were going to put him in jail because I guess it doesn't really affect his career in the long run, but at that time, not really in his peak either, but just of how hot he was, just career-wise, and for the government, the US government, to take that away, just because he was influencing black culture, he was just gyrating his hips. It's very crazy to me, and I felt sorry for him in that moment.
I think for me, like especially like when his mum died, like I don't know if that feels like an obvious one, but like I feel like that was like all they'd really known like completely his whole life. Obviously, like his dad had been in prison and stuff, but that was like his standalone. She was always looking out for him. She was the one questioning like before they signed the initial contract with the colonel and everything. But then also I think when he's in the car with Priscilla and like he's just said bye to Lisa Marie, like when she was like pleading with him, like please just come and get some rest, like you can't help but think if he had gone and got the rest, maybe like it wouldn't have been so young as 42.
Yeah, I liked that scene. I think that they did a good job of making it so clear how close he was to his mum. But for me, the moment when I had the most sympathy was when the curtains were drawn at one of his shows in Vegas, and he was, I think, on one knee having finished the show, and he was dripping with sweat, and he was just panting and panting like he was a workhorse. And that's the moment when I thought, I really do dislike Colonel Tom Parker, because he wouldn't have to be doing this if he could just go to Europe, if he could go to Japan, if he could do these things. And I'm not saying that he shouldn't work really hard, I'm not saying he should be put through that, but he just looked absolutely exhausted, and you sort of see where he was being taken advantage of.
It does
throughout.
Does remind you of somewhat of Britney Spears, of artists like that who are exploited. But it does also make me think is, regardless of the manager, would they always have struggled with fame and also meeting other people's standards as well as their own, you know, releasing albums, touring worldwide. And Elvis, in a way, to defend the Colonel, you could say if Elvis had done international tours, which would have helped his career, would have it been even worse, the sweating and being a workhorse, if he was in China and
everywhere,
England and
part
Africa, instead of just around US cities.
Well, part of me thinks that it wouldn't necessarily have been any different in that respect, but knowing that that's what he'd wanted to do, it wouldn't have felt like he was doing the same show 178 times in a year, which is what I read on
There'd be not
Wikipedia.
fewer of them, it'd just be more places.
Yeah, he'd go to so many different places and he'd experience a completely different energy from crowds. He'd experience a completely different atmosphere and environment, whereas he was just in the same concert hall every night.
I feel like
so
the film suggested that was wrong, just as you were saying, but I feel like the film also suggested home is where the heart is, and Elvis loves Graceland, he loves America, he loves his cities. He's almost like that American without a passport that never quite becomes cosmopolitan. And I think there's that side of it too, as well as his autonomy being taken away from him with the contracts and the lawyers and the money inside of him staying at Vegas, really a gilded cage. But I do think there's something to be said that Elvis is just that American who wants to be in America, and not everyone can relate to that, but I think there's always that person who loves their hometown and never wants to go, and I feel like Elvis is that shy individual underneath it all who likes his hometown a lot and doesn't want to spread his wings too far from his mother.
No, but like I disagree in a way, because like he was hungry to travel. He was hungry to get out there. He was tired of the same town of like Vegas. He was tired of doing the same circuit over and over again. He seemed like someone he wanted to explore and he wanted to travel. He even said himself like, "Oh, I want to visit like the UK. I want to visit like Asia." Like, so I see where you're coming from, but at the same time, I see someone in Elvis in that film who wants to go see the world, and just maybe that would have turned out differently in his life, but I don't know.
A question that I want answered from the film is, could you show me a map or a globe of where he's actually been? Because you'll see some real hot spots all across the US and obviously Germany when he was there, but I don't know for a fact whether he has travelled around but just didn't do tours. And I don't know whether that the whole travelling thing is whether he wanted to do that as much as work abroad. But
it was a different era back then for artists to travel. I think when you get to the time of Queen and Elton John, then it is more international, it is more worldwide. But in American artists, it would be Vietnam, Korea, supporting the troops there, and actors, and because they're all part of the same system promoting America worldwide. And for an artist to go abroad, really in the 50s, it would be to, apart from in nightclubs and places like that, it would be to promote the troops that he came from.
I do think it's necessary to critique this film and those other two films with quite a sort of fine lens as well, because I think when you've done a biopic and you've basically there's no other chance for another person to do the same thing, especially if you've got such a budget. Once you've done one person's life in a film, unless they had a really, really long life or you had to put it into 2 or 3 films, it can't really be done again, so you have got to get it right. And I think aspects of this film were really done quite well. Like, you felt you were in a cinematic experience, but at the same time they could have gone a bit further, like with Bohemian Rhapsody. I think you're right, with the death, they had to keep it from being gimmicky. They had to make sure that they honoured and respected the family. Obviously, 2 of whom were still like alive and in public life. One of whom died, as you said, only a couple of weeks ago. But equally, that was also how we remember Elvis, I would say. He died at 42, early 40s. That's, I would say, central to, you know, for me, when I think of Elvis, or at least before I watched this film and I thought of Elvis, I thought he died when he was, 60s. He was washed out, but he was still pretty much
42,
in his...
I think.
Yeah.
He was still pretty young. He
Very,
wasn't quite in his prime, but, he was still doing a lot.
He had a tough life, and that's why he aged so badly, because of the poverty in his life. If you put fame on someone and they haven't had the best childhood and other factors and they're vulnerable, then they're more likely to age. And for someone, even in the past when people aged a lot worse, as a man, he really deteriorated himself health-wise.
I think as well, like, the tolls of performing, like, most... I don't know, like, the stats and figures, like, behind him performing, but they tried to highlight that he was, like, constantly performing, like, constantly on the road.
Work.
And like, the toll that took it on his body, and just him wanting to put on a show for his fans and supporters and just give everything I think that obviously would have had like a major toll on his health and him having to like be in peak physical condition. Not like obviously he's not in.
To me, having so much focus on the manager suggests, in a way, implicitly that Elvis is a manufactured act compared to an artist. So if there's a film on Take That or a boy band, if you had a focus on the manager or Girls Aloud, I would kind of respect that more and understand it, especially if the producers are the ones coming up with the amazing songs and the catchy lyrics and everything. But from this film, it was an odd... I still think it's an odd choice to focus so much on Colonel Parker when, personally, I don't think this film ever gave me the impression that Elvis couldn't have done it without Tom Parker. And I think they really wanted you to think that by the end of it, but I just thought to myself, Colonel Tom Parker hindered his career in many ways, especially in the later years.
Mm-hmm.
And really, once you move on from one manager as an artist, second album, get a new manager. You know, that type of wait for your contract to go out.
Yeah.
So I don't think... I really still don't understand whose idea was it to focus so much on... He could have been a figure just showing him in the film, but not a main character, but still an important character, like
I guess they just wanted
Priscilla.
I guess the idea of it was like they wanted to show how Elvis was financially chained to Tom Parker. They wanted to show how I guess they wanted a bad guy for the film, and Tom Parker in the way that they told him as like this. I guess this puppet master to Elvis. They wanted to show him quite a lot, and they wanted to paint that picture of him, I guess.
I think my final point would be, as you were saying, Brendan, the film set a historical record, so to put Colonel Parker so highly up on the record because of this film, he's gone from obscurity.
Yeah.
And there was like a biographer saying, there's been biographies written about him, and he was saying the film's a bit inaccurate about Colonel Tom Parker, but nevertheless, now he is in the public consciousness.
Yeah.
I don't really agree with that as someone. I just think he should have been consigned to history, especially with just being a manager. I think Elvis will be remembered forever, but I really don't want... I just don't think he deserves it, and not on a ethical or moral note, but really just on how much he actually contributed.